Eleanor Madison believed her $80 million private jet was dead on the runway, until a poor single father named Mason Reed knelt down and drew 3 chalk circles on the hangar floor. Every engineer in the room laughed at him. 7 minutes later, the engine roared back to life and silenced the entire company. But something far more frightening had happened in that hangar. Mason had not simply fixed the aircraft. He had quietly exposed the one person trying to kill Eleanor Madison from inside, hidden behind one engine fault disguised to look natural, accidental, and fatal at altitude. The private airfield outside the city was still wrapped in early morning cold when the hangar lights flickered on over Eleanor Madison's $80 million jet. Rain from the night before had not fully dried on the runway, and a thin mist clung to the tarmac like something unwilling to leave. Inside the hangar, the aircraft sat gleaming under white floodlights, its engines silent, its cabin door open, waiting for a flight that was supposed to decide the future of an entire company. Eleanor stood near the boarding stairs in a charcoal coat, phone pressed to her ear, listening to her assistant confirm that the government delegation in Washington would not wait past noon. The contract on the table was worth more than the company's last 3 years combined, and if Madison Aerosystems failed to deliver a signature by evening, the deal would collapse, and with it very likely her position at the head of the company her father had built from nothing. Connor Vale walked beside her with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 2 decades learning how to sound reasonable while pushing for exactly what he wanted. He suggested, not for the first time that morning, that Eleanor consider granting him temporary signing authority so she would not have to risk traveling under pressure. Eleanor brushed the suggestion aside the way she always did, though something in his persistence had begun to feel less like loyalty and more like rehearsal. She climbed the short metal staircase toward the cockpit door, nodded to the pilot, and gave the order to begin the pre-flight sequence. The pilot turned the ignition switch, and nothing happened. He tried again. The engine gave a faint cough, a brief shudder through the fuselage, and then silence, heavy and absolute, the kind that turns a busy hangar into a held breath. Lucas Grant, the company's senior maintenance engineer, rushed forward with 2 of his junior technicians, already pulling diagnostic tablets from their bags. He assured Eleanor that the aircraft had passed a full inspection the previous evening, that every systophons had been signed off, that whatever was happening now had to be some sudden and unpredictable mechanical failure, the kind that occasionally struck even the most carefully maintained machines. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had personally reviewed the maintenance logs less than 12 hours earlier. Nothing in those reports had hinted at instability. She watched Lucas and his team open the lower access panel, watched their flashlights sweep across wiring and fuel lines, and felt the minutes slipping away with every passing second, each one chipping at the leverage she needed walking into that meeting. Connor remained unusually composed throughout the commotion, watching the engineers work with an expression that was almost serene, as though he already knew how the morning would end. He suggested again, gently this time, that Eleanor allow him to handle the Washington meeting in her place, framing it as protection rather than ambition, insisting that the board would understand a brief absence far better than a missed deadline. Eleanor studied him for a moment longer than necessary, some old instinct stirring beneath her frustration, though she pushed it down and turned back toward the disabled aircraft. Behind them, near the edge of the hangar, a quiet figure in a faded maintenance jacket arrived through the side entrance, carrying a worn toolbox and a clipboard listing a minor contracted repair to a section of vibrating hangar flooring, a job that had nothing to do with the jet and everything to do with what was about to happen. Mason Reed had not been invited to the meeting unfolding around the aircraft, and he made no move to insert himself into it. He set his toolbox down near the wall, glanced once at the commotion surrounding the engine, and began the floor inspection he had actually been hired to perform. He was not an employee of Madison Aerosystems, only a subcontractor brought in for a small structural complaint filed weeks earlier, a low-priority task pushed to the bottom of every list until today. Nobody in that hangar knew his name. Nobody had reason to look twice at a man in scuffed boots crouching near a baseboard while a multi-million-dollar emergency unfolded 20 feet away. But Mason had already heard something in the engine's brief, failed cough that none of the engineers seemed to be listening for, and as he knelt by the wall, his attention drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the floor beneath the aircraft itself. Mason stayed where he was, low against the wall, listening rather than looking, the way he had trained himself to do years earlier in a different life he rarely spoke about. Beneath the noise of the engineers and the static crackle of two-way radios, He picked out the smaller sounds, a secondary pump cycling slightly out of rhythm, a faint metallic tick somewhere beneath the floor plating, a valve releasing pressure in a pattern that did not quite match the rest of the system. None of it was loud. None of it would have shown up on a standard diagnostic readout. But it was there, threaded quietly beneath the chaos, the way a single wrong note can hide inside an otherwise perfect chord if no one is listening closely enough to notice. Lucas spotted him first and barked across the hangar that the engine bay was not a place for floor technicians to wander, his voice sharp with the particular irritation of a man already under pressure who did not appreciate an audience to his struggle. One of the younger engineers laughed under his breath when he saw Mason crouch down near the concrete and run his fingers lightly across a faint ring of dust that had settled in an unusual pattern near the landing gear. It looked, to anyone passing by, like a man wasting time on something irrelevant while real professionals worked on the actual problem. Mason did not look up or attempt to explain himself. He simply continued moving along the floor in small, deliberate steps, occasionally pausing to touch the concrete, occasionally tilting his head as though listening to something only he could hear. Eleanor noticed him almost by accident, catching sight of a stranger kneeling near her aircraft while everyone else stood upright and tense around the open engine panel. She crossed the hangar floor and asked, with more curiosity than authority, what exactly he thought he was doing down there. Mason answered without straightening up, his voice low and unhurried, saying only that an engine could lie to a diagnostic screen, but a floor rarely lied to someone who knew how to read it. Lucas scoffed loudly enough for half the hangar to hear, reminding Eleanor that the man crouched at her feet was not an aviation engineer, merely a subcontractor hired to fix a noisy floor panel months ago and forgotten about since. Eleanor said nothing in response, though something about the stillness in Mason's expression kept her from walking away immediately. Mason asked, almost as an afterthought, whether anyone had a piece of chalk he could borrow, the kind used for marking structural faults during inspection work. Connor's expression shifted instantly, a flicker of something sharper than annoyance crossing his face before he masked it again, suggesting loudly that security escort the unauthorized worker out of the restricted area before he caused any further delay. Eleanor lifted a hand without looking at Connor, a small gesture that nonetheless silenced him completely, and told the nearest technician to find Mason a marker. She did not yet believe the man kneeling on her hangar floor could do anything to help her, but there was a particular quality to his calm, an absence of performance, that stood out starkly against everyone else's barely controlled panic. She decided, against her better judgment, to give him 1 minute before pulling him away from her aircraft entirely. Around them, the hangar had grown louder in the way emergencies always seem to multiply their own noise. Radios overlapping, footsteps echoing off the high metal ceiling, someone shouting for a supervisor who was already standing 3 feet away. Yet Mason seemed almost untouched by it, moving through the commotion the way a man might walk through a familiar room in the dark, trusting his hands and his instincts more than the panic flooding the space around him. He had spent years in rooms exactly like this one, though under far different circumstances, learning that the worst failures rarely announced themselves loudly. They whispered first, in small inconsistencies that most people were too rushed or too proud to notice. Eleanor watched him work without fully understanding why she had not yet walked away, only aware that something about his patience felt like the first honest thing she had encountered all morning. A technician returned with a stick of marking chalk and handed it to Mason without a word, unsure whether he was helping a serious investigation or humoring a man who had wandered into the wrong part of the airfield. Mason thanked him quietly and turned back toward the floor, running his palm once more across the faint horseshoe-shaped smudge near the front landing gear before pressing the chalk down and drawing a slow, deliberate circle around it. The white line stood out sharply against the gray concrete, small and almost childlike against the towering shadow of the aircraft above it. He moved several steps toward the secondary fuel compartment, crouched again, and drew a second circle around a section of flooring where the faintest tremor still lingered, a vibration so slight that most people would have mistaken it for nothing more than the building settling. The third circle came near the engine support strut, surrounding a hairline trace of fluid so thin it barely caught the light, a mark that any rushed inspection would have dismissed as residue from years of normal operation. To the engineers watching, the 3 circles looked like nothing, 3 meaningless loops scratched onto a hangar floor by a man who clearly had no idea how an aircraft of this caliber actually worked. Laughter broke out among two of the younger technicians before Lucas silenced them with a sharp look, though his own mouth curved into something close to a smirk as he asked, loudly enough for the whole hangar to hear, what exactly 3 chalk circles were supposed to do for an $80 million jet that real diagnostic equipment had already failed to explain. Mason straightened slowly, brushing the dust from his knees, and answered without raising his voice that the circles were never meant to fix the aircraft at all. They were there, he said, to show everyone in the room exactly who had been lying to them and for how long. The words landed with a strange weight, and the laughter in the hangar died almost instantly, replaced by a silence that felt suddenly much colder than the morning air outside. Eleanor stepped closer, studying the 3 small circles as though they might rearrange themselves into something she could understand if she looked long enough. She asked him, in a voice stripped of its earlier impatience, how much time he would need. Mason told her 7 minutes, provided no one touched the control panel while he worked. Connor objected immediately, his composure finally cracking at the edges as he insisted this entire exercise was an unacceptable risk before a meeting that could not afford a single additional delay. Eleanor checked her watch, weighed the seconds she had left against the strange certainty in Mason's expression, and made her decision. She granted him exactly 7 minutes, not 1 moment more, and told the hangar to clear a path. Mason asked for 3 things before he began: that someone shut down a secondary auxiliary pump, that another technician open a pressure valve for inspection, and that a small protective cap near the engine mount be removed so he could see what it had been hiding underneath. For a moment nobody moved, the request hanging in the cold hangar air as though everyone was waiting for someone else to decide whether this stranger deserved to be obeyed. Lucas looked toward Eleanor, silently asking whether she truly intended to let an outside contractor direct her own maintenance crew, and Eleanor answered only by nodding once, sharp and final. Reluctantly, a junior technician moved toward the auxiliary pump and shut it down, the low hum beneath the aircraft fading into something closer to true silence. Another engineer cracked open the pressure valve as instructed, releasing a thin hiss of air that seemed to draw every eye in the hangar toward the small white circle marked nearest the fuel line. Mason knelt beside the 3rd circle and waited, watching the protective cap come free in the hands of a hesitant technician, his expression unreadable, betraying neither triumph nor doubt. Only the quiet focus of a man who had done something like this before in circumstances far more dangerous than a private airfield on a cold morning. Connor watched from a few steps back, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his earlier composure replaced now by something tighter and more guarded, though he said nothing further. Catherine Blake, who had arrived moments earlier with an update about the Washington delegation, stood near Eleanor's shoulder, sensing without being told that whatever was unfolding on that hangar floor mattered far more than the schedule she had come to discuss. The 7 minutes had not yet truly begun, but already the entire room had shifted its attention away from spreadsheets and contracts and onto the quiet stranger kneeling between 3 small circles of chalk, waiting for permission to prove what he already seemed certain he understood. In the first minute, Mason asked Lucas to begin a low-pressure diagnostic cycle through the engine's primary system, the same routine procedure the team had already run twice that morning without finding anything unusual. Lucas complied with visible reluctance, watching the readout on his tablet with the wary attention of a man expecting to be proven right about how pointless this entire detour truly was. The numbers climbed steadily at first, exactly as they had during every previous test, giving no immediate hint that anything beneath the surface had changed at all. By the 2nd minute, a single needle on the pressure gauge twitched out of rhythm, half a beat behind where it should have settled, the smallest possible deviation, the kind easily dismissed as instrument noise on any ordinary day. It happened directly above the first chalk circle. Mason pointed at it without speaking, and Lucas's expression flickered, the dismissal in his eyes replaced for the first time by something closer to uncertainty. In the 3rd minute, Mason pressed his palm flat against the floor near the 2nd circle, feeling for the faint vibration he had noticed earlier, confirming that it pulsed slightly out of phase with the rest of the fuel system's normal rhythm, as though something inside that line was working against itself rather than with it. He said nothing yet, only nodded slowly, the way a man might nod at a suspicion finally proven true. The 4th minute brought him to the small connector near the 3rd circle, where he carefully loosened a fitting and discovered a thin bead of sealant noticeably newer than every other surface around it, fresh enough that its edges had not yet dulled with the grime that coated the rest of the assembly. It was a detail no rushed inspection would ever have caught, a seam disguised so carefully that it had been designed specifically to pass unnoticed beneath standard scrutiny. By the fifth minute, Mason had identified what the sealant had been hiding: a miniature reversing valve installed where no such component belonged, small enough to escape a glance yet precisely placed to feed the system false readings under certain pressure conditions an aircraft might encounter only after it had already left the ground and climbed well beyond any safe point of return. In the sixth minute, working quickly now, Mason rerouted a temporary test line around the compromised valve, bypassing the corrupted signal entirely rather than attempting any permanent repair, buying the engine a path to start without trusting the false information the system had been feeding into it all morning. In the seventh minute, the engine caught, hesitated once, and then roared fully to life, the sound rolling through the hangar and silencing every voice inside it. The warning lights on the control panel dimmed one after another until the board showed nothing but steady green. Eleanor stood frozen, watching the aircraft she had believed dead only minutes earlier now humming with quiet, even power, and she understood immediately, with a certainty that had nothing to do with luck, that the man kneeling on her hangar floor had just done something far more significant than a simple repair. She asked him directly whether the jet was now safe to fly. Mason rose to his feet, wiped his hands against his jacket, and told her the engine would run, but that she should not be on it when it did. Eleanor's expression sharpened, demanding to know why, and Mason answered with the same unhurried calm he had carried through the entire 7 minutes, explaining that the fault inside that valve had been built to trigger only after the aircraft reached a certain altitude, designed not to strand her on the ground, but to fail her completely once she was already in the air, and far beyond any hope of help. Eleanor's first order silenced the hangar more completely than the engine had a moment earlier. She demanded the bay doors locked, every security camera preserved exactly as recorded, and not a single person allowed to leave until she understood what had just happened to her aircraft. Connor stepped forward immediately, his voice pitched somewhere between concern and authority, insisting that shutting down the hangar now, hours before a critical meeting, would only deepen the chaos already threatening the company's standing with the government delegation. Eleanor did not look at him when she answered. She told him the meeting could wait, the truth could not. Mason asked quietly whether anyone had access to the previous night's maintenance log, and Lucas, still shaken from the 7 minutes he had just witnessed, handed over the digital file without argument. Scanning the entries, Mason found a final inspection signature time-stamped well after midnight, logged under Lucas's own technical credentials, even though Lucas insisted with visible alarm that he had left the airfield hours before that entry was ever made. Mason cross-referenced the timestamp against the hangar's security footage log and discovered a 12-minute gap in the Eastern camera feed, occurring at precisely the same moment the false inspection had supposedly taken place. Catherine arrived moments later, her expression tight, informing Eleanor that the flight itinerary, along with several internal scheduling documents, had been forwarded overnight to an external account no one in the company recognized. Connor immediately suggested the breach pointed to an outside hacker, perhaps even a rival firm attempting industrial sabotage from beyond their own walls, his explanation arriving almost too quickly, too neatly packaged for the chaos surrounding it. Mason countered calmly that whoever had installed the hidden valve inside that engine would have needed direct physical access to a restricted technical compartment, something no outside hacker, however skilled, could have accomplished from a distance. The weight of that statement settled over the room slowly, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a suspicion she had been refusing to name finally rising close enough to the surface that she could no longer push it back down. She turned the question over silently, wondering who among the people she trusted most might have had both the access and the motive to want her aircraft to fail at exactly the wrong altitude. Mason, watching her face carefully, added one final observation, that the 3 circles had never simply marked a mechanical fault. They marked a deception built carefully enough to fool trained engineers, which meant whoever had built it understood this aircraft, and this company, far better than any stranger ever could. Eleanor walked the length of the hangar slowly, past the silent rows of equipment, and the now quiet engine that had nearly carried her into a disaster no one would have survived to explain. She thought of every person who had access to that compartment in the weeks before this morning, narrowing the list in her mind even as she resisted the conclusion forming at its center. Lucas, pale and visibly rattled by the discovery of his own forged signature, offered to surrender every personal device he owned for inspection, desperate to prove his innocence before anyone could even accuse him aloud. Samuel Pierce, the company's longtime legal counsel, arrived partway through the commotion, drawn by a call from Catherine, and stood quietly near the hangar entrance, watching the unfolding scene with the careful attention of a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous threats inside a company rarely wore the face anyone expected. Mason kept his focus on the physical evidence rather than the swirl of accusations building around him, methodically photographing the sealant residue, the displaced valve, and the chalk circles before anyone could disturb the scene further. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that hangar, how quickly a true story could be buried beneath panic and convenient explanations once enough powerful people had reason to want it forgotten. Eleanor finally turned the question directly toward Mason, asking how an outside contractor hired to fix a noisy floor panel had managed to diagnose a hidden engine fault that her own senior engineering team had completely missed. Mason hesitated before answering, his eyes drifting briefly toward the now silent aircraft rather than toward her face, and said only that he had spent a long time listening to machines fail before they actually failed, and that most of them gave warnings long before anyone wanted to hear them. Samuel Pierce studied Mason from across the hangar with the slow recognition of a man piecing together a memory he had not touched in years. He approached quietly and asked whether Mason had once worked on a defense contractor's engine analysis team years earlier on a project that had ended badly. Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he confirmed it with a single short nod, offering nothing further. Samuel explained to Eleanor, choosing his words carefully, that he remembered the case from his earlier years in corporate law, a vibration fault in a military aircraft system that one young analyst had flagged repeatedly to leadership, only to be overruled each time by men who trusted their schedules more than their instruments. When the failure finally occurred months later, the investigation that followed had needed someone to blame, and the analyst who tried hardest to prevent the disaster became the easiest person to sacrifice for it. Mason left the industry shortly afterward, his name quietly erased from any record worth searching, and rebuilt a smaller, quieter life far from boardrooms and defense contracts, taking whatever maintenance work came his way and raising a child largely on his own in the years since. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, understanding now why Mason carried himself the way he did, why he seemed entirely unmoved by the dismissiveness of men like Lucas and Connor, as though their judgment carried no real weight against everything he had already survived. She felt something shift in her own chest, an unfamiliar kinship forming with a man she had known for less than an hour, both of them having learned, in very different ways, what it cost to be doubted by the very systems meant to protect them. Mason offered no further detail about that earlier chapter of his life, and made clear through his silence that he had no interest in being treated as some kind of hidden hero finally proven right. He said only that he had not come to this hangar looking to relive anything, only to make certain that whatever had happened to him all those years ago did not happen to someone else today, disguised as just another signature on just another routine inspection log. Connor, listening from a short distance away, absorbed this new information with a stillness that did not match his earlier composure, his concern sharpening into something closer to alarm, for he understood, faster than anyone else in the room, that a man capable of reading hidden machinery this clearly was equally capable of reading the people responsible for hiding it. Eleanor ordered a full review of every access record tied to the restricted engine compartment over the previous 2 weeks, and Catherine pulled the data within minutes, scanning entry logs against the building's badge system with quiet, focused urgency. What she found made her go still for a moment before she brought it directly to Eleanor rather than announcing it aloud to the room. Connor's access card had been used near the hangar's restricted section shortly after midnight, logged in the system as a routine administrative check, despite the fact that no administrative inspection had ever been scheduled for that hour. Connor, when confronted, claimed without hesitation that his card must have been cloned, suggesting that someone determined to frame him could easily have duplicated the credentials and used them without his knowledge. Mason asked, in the same unhurried tone he had used throughout the morning, how someone capable of cloning a security badge would also happen to know the exact valve configuration needed to let an aircraft start safely on the ground while guaranteeing it would fail only once it reached a specific altitude. The question hung in the air, precise and unanswerable, and for the first time, Connor did not respond immediately. Lucas, who had spent the morning sneering at Mason's presence, now found himself reconsidering everything with growing unease, his earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that the forged signature bearing his name had not appeared out of nowhere. One of the junior maintenance engineers, pressed gently by Catherine, admitted under quiet questioning that Connor had personally requested a change to the final inspection schedule 2 days earlier, moving the last check to a far later hour than originally planned, a request that had seemed unremarkable at the time and deeply significant now. Cornered by mounting evidence, Connor shifted his approach entirely, turning his accusations toward Mason instead, suggesting loudly that an outside contractor with a documented history of conflict in his previous industry might have engineered this entire crisis purely to extort money from a frightened, vulnerable company. Security guards moved toward Mason on Connor's instruction, and for a moment, the hangar seemed ready to believe the version of events that placed blame on the man who had just saved Eleanor's life, rather than the executive who had spent 2 decades earning her trust. Eleanor stood at the center of that choice, feeling the full weight of it settle onto her shoulders, forced to decide in front of her entire staff whether to trust the longtime colleague who had always told her exactly what she wanted to hear, or the quiet stranger who had told her something she desperately did not want to be true. She made her decision without raising her voice, telling the guards to stand down and ordering instead that every piece of company data, every email, every access log, and every financial record connected to the Washington contract be opened immediately for full and complete review. Connor's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, something cold passing behind his eyes before the practiced warmth returned, and he assured Eleanor that he supported full transparency completely, that he had nothing to hide and welcomed any review that would clear his name. Yet Catherine noticed the way his hand tightened slightly around his phone as he spoke, and she made a quiet note to monitor his device activity over the coming hour, rather than simply trust the easy reassurance he offered the room. Mason remained near the aircraft while the rest of the hangar shifted into a different kind of urgency, no longer focused on repair but on uncovering exactly how deep this deception ran and how many hands had touched it along the way. He said little, watching the dynamics around him with the same patient attention he had given the engine itself, understanding that people, like machines, tended to reveal their truest condition under pressure, in the small inconsistencies they could not quite control, no matter how carefully they had rehearsed their composure. Within the hour, Connor had escalated the morning's chaos directly to the board, convening an emergency video conference and framing Eleanor's behavior as a dangerous loss of judgment at the worst possible moment, accusing her of allowing an unauthorized outside laborer to disrupt a critical engine inspection and delay a deal worth the company's entire future. The shareholders, scattered across several screens, listened with the particular nervousness of people whose investments suddenly felt less secure than they had the day before, and several voices began pressing Eleanor to temporarily transfer signing authority until the situation could be properly clarified. Eleanor felt the trap closing around her with uncomfortable precision, recognizing that she could not physically leave the airfield to defend herself in person without abandoning the very investigation that had just saved her life. Yet remaining behind risked looking exactly like the instability Connor was so carefully describing to the board. Mason, standing just outside the camera's view, suggested quietly that the goal should not be repairing the aircraft fast enough to make the original flight, but instead using the sabotage itself as undeniable evidence strong enough to justify every decision she had made that morning. Samuel Pierce moved quickly through the company's governance documents, searching until he found a clause permitting a chief executive to delay any signing obligation without penalty in the event of a credible documented safety threat to senior leadership, a provision written years earlier by Eleanor's father after a different crisis entirely, one that had never been invoked since. Catherine, working a separate track, traced the leaked flight itinerary back through several layers of forwarding and discovered a prepared press statement already drafted by a rival firm, announcing an unsolicited offer to acquire a controlling stake in Madison Aero Systems, time-stamped from the night before the engine had ever failed. The full shape of the plan became clear to Mason almost before he finished reading Catherine's findings aloud, and he said it plainly to Eleanor without softening the implication. This had never been only about removing her from one meeting. The intended failure at altitude was meant to remove her permanently, sending company stock into a freefall steep enough that a waiting rival could acquire controlling shares for a fraction of their true worth, with Connor positioned perfectly to manage the transition from the inside once she was gone. Eleanor absorbed this with a stillness that masked how deeply the words had landed, and then turned back toward the board still waiting on her screen, her voice steady now in a way it had not been all morning. She announced that she would not be transferring any authority to anyone, that she had uncovered credible evidence of deliberate sabotage targeting her aircraft and her life, and that she intended to present the full technical record live, in real time, to the entire board before another minute of speculation was allowed to continue unchecked. A murmur passed through the scattered screens, several board members exchanging uncertain glances as the tone of the meeting shifted from cautious concern to something far more serious. Connor attempted to interject, insisting that unverified accusations should not be aired before a board already anxious about the company's stability, but Samuel cut through his objection with calm legal precision, confirming on record that the governance clause Eleanor was invoking had been properly documented and was fully enforceable under the company's existing charter. Eleanor felt a small, fierce steadiness settle over her as she watched Connor search for his next argument and fail to find one. For the first time since the engine had refused to start that morning, she felt less like a woman fighting to hold her position and more like someone finally standing on solid ground, ready to let the truth carry the weight she no longer had to carry alone. With the board watching through a live feed connected directly into the hangar, Mason walked the camera slowly through each of the 3 chalk circles, explaining in plain, unhurried language exactly what each one represented and how they connected to form a single deliberate act rather than 3 unrelated accidents. The first circle, he explained, marked a vibration sensor deliberately mistimed to feed false readings into the aircraft's primary system, creating an early failure convincing enough to justify exactly the kind of inspection delay that had occurred that very morning. The second circle marked the secondary fuel line, where pressure had been artificially manipulated to behave normally during ground testing while concealing a fault that would only surface once true flight conditions were reached, a detail no standard inspection protocol had ever been designed to catch. The third circle, nearest the engine mount, marked the fresh sealant hiding the miniature reversing valve itself, the single component responsible for translating an ordinary engine into a controlled, deniable disaster. Lucas, watching alongside the board, confirmed on record that the technical findings matched everything his own team had since independently verified, his earlier scorn for Mason now replaced entirely by quiet, sober respect. Samuel Cross referenced the timeline of the sabotage against the badge access records, aligning every suspicious entry precisely with the 12-minute gap in camera coverage from the night before. Catherine then presented the recovered email correspondence, fully restored despite earlier attempts to delete it, showing direct communication between Connor and a representative from the rival firm preparing the acquisition announcement. Connor, recognizing the moment had finally turned entirely against him, attempted to step away from the camera's view, only to find Mason and Lucas positioned quietly on either side of him, neither raising a hand nor a voice, simply ensuring he remained present for what came next. He turned instead to threats, warning Eleanor that exposing this sabotage publicly would terrify the government delegation and guarantee the loss of the very contract she was trying so desperately to save, insisting that silence, however uncomfortable, remained the only path that protected the company's future. Eleanor answered him without hesitation, her voice carrying clearly across every screen still connected to the call. She told him that losing one contract was a wound the company could survive and eventually recover from, but that covering up an attempt on her life, an attempt that had nearly succeeded, would not merely cost Madison Aero Systems a single deal. It would cost the company every shred of trust it had ever earned, and trust, once buried that deeply, never truly came back from the grave. A long silence followed her words, stretching across every connected screen until one of the senior board members finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm, stating that he, for one, would rather stand behind a CEO willing to expose an uncomfortable truth than one willing to bury it for convenience. Several other voices followed in agreement, the earlier pressure to strip Eleanor of her authority dissolving as quickly as it had formed only an hour before. Connor looked around the hangar, searching for some remaining ally among the faces now turned firmly against him, and finding none, his shoulders dropped slightly, the practiced composure finally abandoning him entirely. Mason stepped back from the circles, letting the evidence speak for itself, understanding that his part in uncovering the technical truth had reached its natural end, and that what remained now belonged to the people whose job it was to weigh consequences and deliver justice. Lucas approached him quietly, extending a hand and admitting, without excuses, that he had been wrong to dismiss him so completely that morning, a small gesture that nonetheless carried real weight inside a hangar that had spent the entire day learning who deserved to be underestimated and who did not. Even with the board turning firmly against him, Connor made one last attempt to salvage his position, quietly triggering a contingency he had clearly prepared in advance, deleting a portion of the shared technical files and sending an altered safety report to the government delegation's liaison before anyone in the hangar realized what he was doing. Catherine caught the outgoing transmission within minutes, alerting Eleanor that a falsified document had just been sent under the company's official letterhead, one that claimed the morning's engine failure had been fully resolved through routine maintenance with no security concerns whatsoever. Cornered again, Connor pivoted sharply, turning his accusation directly toward Mason, declaring loudly that the contractor who had been the last person to physically touch the engine system was the only individual with the technical skill and unsupervised access necessary to have installed the hidden valve himself. For a brief, tense moment, several engineers glanced uncertainly between the two men, the accusation landing with just enough plausibility to seed real doubt in a room already exhausted by hours of shifting loyalties. Mason remained perfectly calm, asking only that someone examine the chalk markings themselves before drawing any further conclusions. He pointed out that the 3 circles had not merely identified the sabotage technically, they had also preserved the scene precisely as it stood before his own arrival, and a careful look at the dust and chalk lines would show whose footprints had crossed which circle and when. A junior technician knelt beside the 3rd circle and confirmed, with visible surprise, that a clear boot print cut directly across its outer edge, a print far too large to belong to Mason and matching, instead, the distinctive tread pattern of the shoes Connor was currently wearing. Catherine, working quickly, pulled footage from a low-angle security camera near the engine mount that everyone had assumed was non-functional after the earlier gap in coverage. Though the footage was grainy and partially obscured, careful enhancement revealed a faint reflection caught in the curved metal surface of the engine housing itself, showing a figure bent close to the valve assembly hours before Mason had ever entered the hangar that morning. The reflection was imperfect, but unmistakable enough once compared against Connor's build and the particular way he tilted his head while concentrating, a habit several long-term employees in the room immediately recognized without needing to be told whose silhouette they were looking at. Lucas studied the footage carefully, then turned to address the room directly, stating plainly that there was no possible way Mason could have installed a component requiring specialized access hours before he had ever set foot inside the restricted compartment that day. The accusation Connor had thrown collapsed entirely under its own weight, and for the first time since the morning began, he offered no further argument, no fresh explanation, only a long defeated silence as 2 members of hangar security stepped forward and asked him, quietly but firmly, to come with them. Eleanor watched him go without satisfaction, only a quiet, tired sorrow settling over her as she considered how many years she had trusted this man with decisions far smaller than the ones that had nearly cost her everything. Samuel moved immediately to begin the formal process of severing Connor's authority within the company, ensuring every signature, every account, and every remaining access credential tied to his name was suspended before the day ended. Catherine, still working through the recovered files, confirmed that the falsified safety report sent to the government liaison had been intercepted in time, replaced instead with an honest account of the sabotage and the steps already taken to address it. By midday, the aircraft had undergone a complete and thorough inspection, every system checked twice over by a team no longer rushing against the clock, and Eleanor made the decision not to board it for the trip to Washington, despite the fact that it had now been fully cleared to fly. Instead, she connected to the delegation through a secure video link from the airfield's small operations office, choosing transparency over speed, and laid out the entire morning in honest, unflinching detail, including the sabotage, the deception, and the contractor whose quiet observation had prevented a disaster no one in the room had been prepared to imagine. The delegation, rather than withdrawing the offer as Connor had warned, responded with cautious respect, telling Eleanor that a company willing to expose its own internal threat so openly demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity their long-term contract required. They granted her an extension of 2 additional days to finalize the paperwork, and Madison Aero Systems did not lose the deal that had nearly cost Eleanor her life to protect. In the days that followed, Eleanor offered Mason a formal position within the company, proposing a title that sounded impressive on paper but meant little to a man who had never cared much for titles in the first place. Mason declined the version she initially offered, asking instead for something simpler and far more consequential: a newly created department with the authority to halt any flight, any inspection, or any signature the moment a genuine safety concern was identified, regardless of deadlines, contracts, or pressure from above. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, recognizing that the very independence Mason was requesting was exactly what had been missing the morning her engine first refused to start. Lucas sought Mason out personally before the week ended, extending a more complete apology than the brief handshake offered in the chaos of that first afternoon, admitting candidly that his early dismissal had been built entirely on appearances rather than evidence, a mistake he intended never to repeat with anyone wearing a maintenance jacket instead of a company badge. The two men did not become close friends overnight, but a quiet, durable respect settled between them, the kind built only after one party has been proven completely and undeniably wrong. Later that same week, Mason received a short call during a quiet moment between meetings, his voice softening instantly as he spoke briefly and gently to someone waiting for him at home, the conversation lasting only a few minutes before he returned to the work in front of him. It was a small, ordinary moment easily missed by anyone not paying close attention, yet it revealed everything necessary about the life Mason carried quietly outside the walls of Madison Aero Systems, a life he had no intention of placing in the center of anyone's spotlight, least of all his own. Eleanor caught the tail end of that call from across the hangar office and chose not to ask about it, sensing instinctively that some parts of a person were meant to remain private even after trust had been earned in every other respect. She had learned enough that week to understand that the most capable people she had ever encountered were rarely the ones eager to talk about themselves, and that Mason's silence on the matter said more about his character than any explanation could have managed. The company itself seemed steadier in the days that followed, not because the danger had vanished entirely from corporate life, but because everyone who worked beneath that hangar roof now understood, in a way they never had before, exactly how much could hinge on a single overlooked detail noticed by the right pair of eyes. Several weeks later, the hangar that had once held its breath around a dead engine looked entirely different, brighter somehow, though little about its physical structure had actually changed. The 3 chalk circles that had marked the floor that morning were long gone, scrubbed away during routine cleaning within days of the incident. Yet Eleanor had quietly arranged for a photograph of the original scene, circles and all, to be framed and hung inside the company's flight safety office, a permanent reminder of exactly how close everything had come to disappearing. No one in the building referred to Mason as an outside contractor anymore. He moved through the hangar now with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there completely, leading a small but fiercely independent safety division that answered to no one's deadline but its own careful judgment. Engineers who had once laughed at 3 circles on a concrete floor now sought him out directly whenever something felt slightly wrong, trusting his instincts in a way they had once reserved only for diagnostic screens and official protocols. Eleanor found him one afternoon standing near the same aircraft that had nearly carried her into disaster months earlier, now fully repaired and gleaming under proper maintenance for the first time in its history. She stood beside him for a long moment before speaking, telling him quietly that what he had done that morning had never really been about restarting one engine. He had restarted something far larger, the conscience of a company that had grown too comfortable trusting appearances over truth. Mason considered her words for a moment, then offered a small, tired smile, answering that machines almost always gave warning before they failed completely. The real difficulty was never the warning itself, but convincing people too proud or too busy to actually listen for it. Eleanor looked out toward the runway stretching beyond the open hangar doors. The same stretch of tarmac where her entire future had once seemed to hinge on 7 uncertain minutes, and understood, perhaps for the first time in her career, that real authority had never lived inside a title or a signature. It lived instead in the willingness to stand beside the truth even when everyone else in the room had already decided to look away. Lucas, watching them both from across the hangar one last time before heading home for the evening, found himself thinking back to the moment he had laughed loudest at 3 meaningless circles scratched into concrete, and felt no shame in admitting, at least to himself, how completely wrong he had been. Samuel Pierce, finalizing the last of the legal paperwork related to Connor's departure, remarked privately to Eleanor that her father would have recognized something familiar in Mason, a quiet competence that never needed an audience to prove its worth, and that he would have been proud of the choice she made that morning when everything pointed her toward doubt instead of trust. The story closed not with applause or celebration, but with something quieter and more lasting, the simple image of Mason walking unhurried across a clean, ordinary hangar floor, the same floor that had once held 3 small chalk circles capable of changing the fate of an entire company and the life of the woman who ran it. If you want to know exactly who those 3 small chalk circles truly exposed, stay close until the final word.